For our next unit, we will be focusing on self-portraits. You will be working with acrylic paint again, and you will be looking to create a self-portrait that explores who you are as a person, not just what do you look like. Artists have been doing self-portraits for years, and we do self-portraits in almost every class we teach here at the high school because you are an ever-changing subject and you can learn a great deal from each self-portrait you paint or draw or sculpt. A portrait is usually a picture of an artist. Generally, we think a portrait as chest up, and they've usually painted or drawn it from a reflection in a mirror. These examples are from Rembrandt. Part of why we do self-portraits, or why artists have done them for years, is because the model is cheap. It's yourself, so you can just look in a mirror or some other reflective surface and draw or paint yourself. Also, self-portraits, the subject changes each time you look at yourself. You've changed from yesterday or the day before, and over years you change as you grow and age and become a new and different person. So there's an introspective nature to looking at yourself. These two drawings are by Kath Kollwitz. She is a self-portrait artist who lived in Germany during World War I and World War II. She lived in great poverty. You may be surprised to know that these are actually portraits of a woman. You can really see her suffering on her face. Her spouse was killed, one of her children was killed, and she just really expresses through these drawings what she went through and how things affected her. Judith Leister is a female artist, and in art we often don't really look at a lot of women artists. She painted in Holland in the early 1600s, and I think this is an interesting self-portrait because she really wanted you to know that she was an artist in her own right, so she chose to paint herself painting, which is what she did for a living. So she was a famous Dutch artist, and she worked for Frans Hals, who probably was more famous than her, but she was equally as talented. This is a painting by Albrecht Dürer, and you can always tell his images because he does that cool little signature that you see up there in the upper left part of the picture. He was known for his draftsmanship, meaning he was really good at drawing, and his paintings show that accurate detail. This is a painting. It was painted with a tiny, small brush, and his marks are very linear, almost like cross-hatching in a way. My favorite is the fur and his hair. It's amazing. These are both by Raphael. He was one of the 4 Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, but he was also one of the 4 great artists of the Renaissance. And Raphael died when he was only 20, I think he was 27. And so we didn't get a lot of his work, but in his short life there were a great many things that he left behind for us to look at. He would often paint large murals and frescoes in public buildings, and he would often, while he was doing that, he would sort of hide himself within the frescoes. So you can see on the right, that's his face there, hidden amongst the people in that fresco. This is Michelangelo, and as you know, he is one of the other Mutant Ninja Turtles, but he's also one of the other famous 4 artists from the Renaissance. We think of Michelangelo mostly as a sculptor, but he was also an architect and a drawer and painter. And so the pictures you see here are paintings that he did. The left side is a self-portrait. The right side, at first you might say, well, where is the self-portrait? It's actually the skin. This is part of the Sistine Chapel, and it's part of a painting that he did depicting God judging the souls on the last day. And so he chose to paint himself as an unworthy soul who's already slipped his skin, and there his skin hangs, waiting to be tossed away and judged. Pablo Picasso is another artist who I think it's interesting to look at in terms of his self-portraits. He changed his style often, And when you study Picasso, it's almost like you're studying multiple artists at the same time. The one on the left is when he was like 15 or 16 years old. He was already better than most of the teachers that he had in school, and he was able to depict himself very realistically in very few strokes of a piece of charcoal. Picasso is famed to have, when he was like 1 or 2 years old, the first word he supposedly said was lapis, which means the pencil. So he was a child prodigy artist and was very talented and very famous. The painting in the middle is Picasso kind of changing direction in his career, showing more color, more loose, expressionistic style of painting, even using green in the colors of his face. And the one to the right is when Picasso had actually, for the first time, viewed African art, specifically African masks. And his art started to change again. He started to use kind of the angles and shapes that he saw in those tribal masks, and his work became simplified into what we now know as abstract and eventually cubist art. Vincent van Gogh, as you know, led a fairly tragic life. He struggled with mental health and poverty most of his life. He was a very intense individual, and sometimes the rest of the world just didn't live as intensely as Vincent. He painted many self-portraits because, as I said before, he didn't have the money to pay models, so he used himself as a model. I think what's interesting about his portraits is they really do kind of trace his descent into mental health and depression, slow but sure. You can check out the link here and visit that and see some more of his art on ArtLex. I think some of his most famous self-portraits are the ones that really start to use color in an expressive way. You can see in these two from 1987, the one on the left is kind of blue and sad looking. He tried to depict that sadness. The sky starts to almost swirl in on him. The one on the right actually is him smiling just a tiny little bit. This was during a period when he was actually very happy. He was living in the south of France in an area called Provence, and he's wearing a sun hat, and he tried to paint using golden yellows and to capture the energy and the warmth of the sun in his paintings from this period. The next painting was painted just before the time when Van Gogh descended into depression. He was really struggling to hang on mentally. He was fighting with the artist partner that he had, Paul Gauguin. He had a girl that he wasn't getting along with, and this was just prior to the incident where he cut off one of his ears and ended up in a mental hospital and eventually killed himself, although some people feel that he may have been murdered instead of killed accidentally. That's something you might want to look up online. There's some more interesting stories about him. Frida Kahlo, as you might remember, is who I dressed as for Halloween a week ago. Frida is known as a surrealist. She's a Mexican artist, and when she was 18 years old, she suffered a major accident. She was on a bus, and the bus crashed, and a pole pierced through her abdomen, her spine, and most of her reproductive organs. So she spent the next year and a half of her life in a full body cast in bed. And so to amuse herself and keep herself from going crazy with boredom, she started painting. And so canvases were set up for her, and she became a painter. These depict Frida as she saw herself, and they're known as surrealists because they have a kind of dreamlike quality to them. They're about reality, but they're not exactly real. There are a lot of symbolism used in surrealist paintings, and she was the master of symbols. These images depict her relationship with her husband, Diego Rivera, who was also an artist. And you can see in the drawing, she shows herself kind of holding his hand and happy. The one on the right, where there's two kind of weird faces merged, it's her face merged with Diego's. He was her sun and her moon, and it kind of depicts the idea that they were joined together and couldn't be separated. Although they did fight quite a bit in their marriage. They did not always get along. The one on the top, she called her two hearts, and she always said she felt torn between traditional Mexico and the westernization of Mexico and how the European culture was becoming embedded in Mexico. So this is her attempt to portray the idea of both the Western and the traditional Mexican cultures. Andy Warhol is a photographer, but I think it's interesting to look at his imagery because he would use his photos to produce paintings and prints. And so this is an example of some of his. He was a very shy person, and so he often depicted himself kind of hidden in camouflage or with his eyes closed, so you couldn't look into him and know what he was thinking. Jenny Saville is a current artist. She's from Britain, and her paint, I would call it almost juicy. She does this extreme realism to the point where it's kind of grotesque. She deals with identity issues related to weight and to surgeries. She does these paintings where she'll actually lay on a glass table and photograph what her nude body looks like through the glass, which usually distorts it greatly because of the glass and the pressure. So her paintings are intriguing. If you look her up, you may not be able to look at a lot of her images here at school, but her work is quite beautiful. Lucian Freud is another painter who I think is worth looking at. His work is very realistic to the point of almost being grotesque. He painted with extreme honesty and used paint very expressionistically, almost to the point where the paint looks like it's sculpted onto the canvas. Kahind Wiley is a current artist, an African-American artist who has taken a twist on some of the old masters. He takes usually black men and women who normally aren't exactly society's role models, so to speak, and he casts them in the role of a role model. So he will draw and paint them in these very elaborate canvases that show a very detailed background that's almost like from the Renaissance, but then he will put the current modern artists on top of that. This is another one by him. This is Katie Musoff. She is actually a local artist who I'm friends with, and I think her portraits are beautiful. She's actually earning a living as an artist painting portraits. She uses a lot of layers of color, and I think one of the things she does really well is remembering that flesh isn't just about white and orange and pink. It's about all the other tones that you need to use to portray color, things like blue and violet and orange and green and all the colors to help create those shadows. She uses a loose painterly style, and she attended MyEd for school. So you're going to be drawing this sketch into your sketchbook right now. I want you to copy what you see here and use this as kind of a guide of how to start mapping out your portraits in your sketchbook. The half line, the horizontal half line that's kind of going across the top of the eyes, the ears, is where your eyes go. They kind of are on that centered line. And then the line partway down depicts where the nose ends, and then the mouth is centered on that final line. So take a moment to draw this in your sketchbook. Remember, you can always go back in this presentation if you have to. Here are just some other things to remember. When you're painting eyes or drawing eyes, remember they are a ball, it's a sphere. So you need to think about what happens when a ball is placed inside of a socket, what kind of shadows occur, and you need to paint that accordingly. So as you're thinking about shading and rendering, you need to think about that spherical plane. Here are some thoughts about eyes. Remember that the center of the iris is above the corners of the mouth. The iris is half the width of the eye, and the eye is the unit of measure when drawing a portrait. So you can measure the width of the eyes, and it should be about 5 eyes across if you measure across your face where the eyes are. Notice that the lower eyelid disappears behind the upper, and that wrinkles are created when your eyes are open. So that's what forms the eyelid. It's because your eye is open, and it's the wrinkle around that sphere. The width of the eye is the same as the space between the eyes. Eyelashes usually aren't painted on the whole area. They usually only are visible at the edges. So don't do that whole spider thing. Noses are the hardest thing to paint or draw. Remember that the nose sticks out the farthest from the face, so it casts dramatic shadows. And drawing or painting a nose really happens not with line, but with shading and rendering. So the nose sticking out is going to be the lightest area that you see. And then the areas immediately off of the nose become the darkest areas. So those curves and shadows are the key to how do I portray the nose. Here are a few more facts about noses, so jot these down. The upper lip is usually narrower than the lower. The upper lip is also slightly darker because it sits in the shadow of the nose. The line that separates the lips is never really straight because the lips are made up of a series of kind of almost like circular forms. And remember that the lips, when they vanish back into the mouth, are vanishing back in a rounded way, so there needs to be a shadow where the two lips meet. There's also a shadow at the base of the lips as they round into the chin. Other parts to think about when you're painting a portrait is that your hair never is completely flat against your head, even if you have a really cropped hairstyle, unless you're almost bald. Everyone's hair is different, so you need to paint what you see, draw what you see. Go big instead of small. It's okay to a little bit overemphasize the size of your hair. Notice where your neck begins. Your neck begins at the point behind your ears. Don't be guilty of making a lollipop person. And remember that your shoulders support the weight of your head. So your shoulders need to be one head tilt either way, wide enough to support that width. Notice that your neck curves into your shoulders. And take a look at your jawline and figure out what shape, what is my jawline? Is it straight? Is it curvy? Is it jagged? What kind of a jawline do you have? These are some painted self-portraits from past art students. And I'm not saying they're the best, but I think they did a decent job of portraying themselves in paint. The one on the left is, I think, one of the best ones I've ever seen. This student was really good at using color creatively and expressionistically. Here are a couple more. These are some other self-portraits that are more stylized, but I think they're quite beautiful. These are by Megan Becker, you might recognize on the left, who graduated last year, and Amber Wilson on the right, which this isn't exactly a self-portrait, but it was based on some thoughts about self. These are not self-portraits, but they are drawings by a student that are portraits, and they get at the same idea. Amber Wilson on the left, Nate Knutson on the right, self-portraits. The one on the left is a painting, the one on the right is a drawing, color pencil.